Did you know that mindfulness is more than just about making us happy and calm and peaceful? Yeah, there's more to it than that. Come on, let's learn. Hello, and welcome to Mindfulness Voyage. My name is Ted Meissner. I'm a mindfulness teacher. And today we're going to explore something that doesn't come up very often when we first start a mindfulness practice. And that is that mindfulness is more than just about becoming calm and happy or peaceful. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a wonderful motivation for many of us to cope with the stressors and difficulties in our lives. But it's more than that. If you're the kind of person who is impacted by the distress of those around you, that's something that you're going to encounter the more you have a mindfulness practice. And that's a good thing. It doesn't mean that it's overwhelming for you, just that your impact of feeling for others when they're having a hard time, well, that's something that fits very well with mindfulness practice. Our guest today is Adam Kay. Adam, welcome to the podcast. Good to see you.
Thanks, Ed. Hi.
Very glad to have you here. And in particular, because as we were speaking before the recording started, I very rarely get to speak to a researcher who's done research that's part of a university as a business school. And so I really want to talk more about this particular topic. But before we dive into the research, I wonder if you might tell us just what got you involved with mindfulness. How did you land here?
Yes. Well, thanks for the question. Let's see, I started in mindfulness as a practitioner. I dove right into the deep end. I never knew a thing about it until 2010. And then I dove straight in, said, hey, this is something I think I'd like to learn about. So why not do a 10-day retreat? So I jumped into the deep end and took to it like a fish to water, I have to say. And it immediately became central in my life and really shifted everything for me, quite honestly. And then
PhD program.
So that was prior to the PhD. That's right. And then maybe a couple of years later, it was actually on another. I had a sense that that this was something that I wanted to make more central to my life, and maybe in the form of work, but I wasn't sure what that might look like. And it was on. I remember clearly. It was on day 7 of yet another 10-day retreat, where I was quite in a fairly deep state for me anyway, and it just kind of popped out of nowhere. This kind of light bulb moment of what data exists on this out there, and specifically in the domain of mindfulness and leadership, mindfulness in the business space. The idea being that there's only so many one-on-one conversations you can have, and in any event, I'm not one to proselytize or be too pedantic about anything, and it's not my style anyway. More about what's if robust data could be generated to describe and this phenomenon, then many more people could make informed choices for themselves without me needing to say a word. So in some ways, I could have many times more conversations through data in a fair, non-pushy manner that, quite frankly, was also in alignment with my curiosity. Going, there is a universe of to be discovered here, and I don't pretend to know it all, not at all. But I would sure enjoy the pursuit, and so that was the light bulb moment. And I returned from that retreat and quickly got on the web and looked around. Who's doing this? And at the time there was, especially in the business domain, at the time there was a trickle. And so I quickly, I had no business actually applying for a PhD to do a PhD in this. I had no background in psychology, none whatsoever. I was a lawyer by trade, a business practitioner before that, and And I applied to just a handful of schools based on a combination of quality of school and geographic location, frankly. And as it turns out, I bamboozled them at UBC to give me a full scholarship somehow. I honestly, still to this day, don't know how. But here's the interesting thing: is that my advisor, Daniel Skarlicki, at the time, this was 2012 when I started. He took me in on one of my first days, and he said, "You know, Adam, if you had applied to us just last year, just 1 year ago, with your research proposal about mindfulness in the business domain, you would have been laughed out of the halls. But he's a smart guy, and he knows which way the winds are blowing, and he could sense a shift in momentum out there, and he wanted to be part of it as well. And so he really handpicked me into the program for that reason. And the timing was that delicate. From 2011 to 2012, the winds were shifting, and so I guess I got in, fairly early on the ground floor in the business domain, in what has since become a bit of a groundswell of research on mindfulness and organizational studies. Yeah,
that is wonderful, and congratulations on having good timing. That's wonderful. I'm glad that worked for you.
The universe conspiring for your benefit, right? What can you do?
So let's talk a bit about the paper itself and the research. And I should mention this is actually a series of studies. So I'm wondering if you just mention what's the premise of the series. Tell people about it who may not have heard of any of this research before.
This is the paper on mindful outrage that we're talking about. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So the basic idea here is that prior to launching this multi-series set of studies, there had been a couple papers out there investigating mindfulness in what's called the moral domain, or mindfulness and justice. So look, there's a vast literature out there. We all know that mindfulness helps us regulate so-called negative emotion, right? It helps reduce stress, anxiety, these sorts of things, right? And so then the question becomes, well, what about mindfulness in the moral domain, specifically with respect to breaches of fairness, breaches of justice? So usually when we experience some form of injustice, we experience negative emotion, right? So now there had been 2 or 3 studies that actually came out while I was pursuing this research as well. So coterminous, prior and coterminous. One was a 2015 paper by in Journal of Applied Psychology by Long and Christian, showing that mindfulness reduces anger in victims of injustice, leading them to be less likely to retaliate against the perpetrator of injustice. So that's consistent with the idea that mindfulness reduces negative emotion. And then, subsequently, a couple of papers came out from the perpetrator of injustice's perspective, that mindfulness apparently reduces guilt in perpetrators of injustice. That's a recent paper by Andy Haffenbrack in Journal of Personality Social Psychology. There's been a couple other studies on that topic as well. And in fact, the findings are kind of mixed. Some papers show that it reduces guilt. Others show that it increases guilt. I think there's something really interesting there to talk about, but we can delay that to another time. So in any event, there had been a couple papers. One from the victim's perspective, mindfulness lowers anger. Second, from the perpetrator's perspective, mindfulness reduces guilt. But there's only one of us, right? There's only one of us to be a victim or one of us to be a perpetrator. But the world has 8 billion people in it plus, right? And in fact, the most common experience of injustice out there is not justice that we perpetrate or experience, but injustice that we witness perpetrated by others against others. The most common form of injustice out there. And so this was an unexplored question. And what it raised for me was, well, an opportunity to examine this. What would a mindful observer of injustice do? How would they respond? But the the response wasn't immediately so intuitive to me. It seems like there could be one of two possibilities, well, possibly three possibilities. So one would be that, consistent with the voluminous literature out there showing that mindfulness lowers negative emotions, or tempers negative emotion, that mindfulness in observers of injustice would lead them to be indifferent, maybe not as angry as others, right? And if that were the case, that would be kind of an interesting problem, right? Because then meditators could rightfully be criticized for twiddling their thumbs while Rome burns, as Cicero would put it. And that didn't quite sit right with me.
Yeah.
But I thought, if it did work out that way, I thought, well, that would be an interesting thing to highlight, an interesting kind of shadow side of mindfulness to explore.
Yeah, and I just want to add at this point to the beginning of the paper itself, and I'm going to link to that as well as the article about it, is that it opens with a quote from my friend Ron Purser about how mindfulness can be used as a tool of oppression, of people becoming numb, and avoidance and suppression,
right,
rather than engagement. And that was a perfect way to start that paper, because Ron and I have spoken about that many times.
Yeah.
Mindfulness is not about avoidance or suppression. Mindfulness is about engaging with, and that wasn't a perspective he had at the time that he wrote that particular piece and some others. So thank you for putting that in there.
Yeah, no, that was actually my co-author Theo Masters Vargas find. He found that one, so credit to him. And I want to say, a lot while I'm on the topic, that this isn't just my paper. This is together with my three co-authors, Theo Masters Varga, Jochen Reb, and Pavlos Vlachos, and that they're all three co-contributors. They're equal second authors. They're only listed alphabetically, and they all brought valuable contributions to the project. So I just want to be clear about that at the outset.
Thank you for giving credit's due. I appreciate that.
No, it's important. It's important. And okay, so that was one possibility, and we called that the mindful sedation hypothesis. That mindfulness would make observers of third-party injustice, experience lower levels of negative emotion, and thereby be less likely to visit retribution upon the offender, which is the normal response to witnessing injustice. So you want to make the perpetrator pay in some form. So, honestly, Ted, that was my initial hunch. That was kind of, I thought, that's interesting. It doesn't sit perfectly well, but if I had to guess, that would be the way that I think this is probably going to go.
Yeah.
But and then we ran. Initially, it was Pavlos and I who started the first couple studies before inviting Theo and Jochen onto the paper, and the data told us otherwise. The data told us, in fact, the opposite. That when observers of injustice witnessed that injustice, that mindfulness increased, amplified what's called moral outrage, which is a common emotional response. It's a composite of contempt, anger, and disgust. This family of moral emotions called other condemning moral emotions. So moral outrage directed at the perpetrator. And what we found in the first couple of studies, which didn't end up making it in the paper, but we were kind of taken aback and forced to make sense of this, and not once but twice, that mindfulness amplified moral outrage at perpetrators of injustice. So it flew in the face of the volumes of literature showing that mindfulness lowers negative emotion, and in fact showing that it amplifies not just any emotion, but a hot emotion, like an other condemning emotion, like moral outrage. And we thought, well, this is interesting, and we really need to dig into this, and we need to do a proper, thorough investigation across lots of different methods and get some behavioral data. And so at that point, we invited Jochen and Theo onto the paper, and it became a truly international collaboration at that point. And so we had a couple studies in the pocket, and then we continued to look at this. The finding just kept replicating, showing in fact, that mindfulness amplifies moral outrage. And so this is what came to be called in the paper the mindful enlivening hypothesis. It's not the mindful sedation hypothesis that held, it's the mindful enlivening hypothesis that mindfulness enlivens people to injustice perpetrated by others against others, leading to higher levels of moral outrage and subsequently a greater likelihood to seek retribution against the offender, the perceived offender. So that's the story in a nutshell about how it unfolded and the competing hypotheses at play. And then we sought to be as rigorous as possible across 4 or 5 remaining studies to really kind of push the edges of this and go, okay, well, is there does this phenomenon of the mindful enlivening hypothesis apply in some contexts more than others, which we examined in study 3 of the paper, which was conducted in the behavioral labs at Singapore Management University. And then subsequently, we were also asked by reviewers at OVHDP to examine not just what context might this be more applicable than others, but for whom, for what individuals might this be more relevant than others. So we looked at different boundary, like the main phenomenon, but then also a contextual and individual difference boundary condition to really, try to chart the contours of this phenomenon and see what's really going on here.
Yeah, because not everyone is alike, and let alone cultural differences and sociopolitical views and personal history and all the rest of it.
Exactly right.
For some folks, it'll be, well, as it was with you took to mindfulness like a duck to water very easily. For others, it might be more challenging.
That's right.
And how you respond. And again, I just want to refresh the understanding that this was not about an injustice done to the meditator, to the mindfulness person. This was them observing it as a third party happening to someone else.
That's right.
What strikes me is how, not having thought of this before, and which is why this caught my eye, is that it actually is consistent with the idea of mindfulness being a turning towards things and being a social engagement kind of territory, that it's not just solo navel gazing off on a mountaintop, that there are social implications to this as well.
That's right. So we know that mindfulness has sort of pro-social implications, right? There's more compassion, there's more empathy. It has a sort of pro-social orientation about it. And let's be clear, we were also in these series of studies, we measured mindfulness as a psychological state, like an ephemeral state. We measured mindfulness as a dispositional trait, like a personality trait. And we also tested it in the final study through a mindfulness manipulation in an experimental setting. We didn't do a long-term mindfulness intervention study. That wasn't part of this package. But so it wasn't just meditators, as you say, it was people with varying levels of dispositional mindfulness as well. So we were really, really triangulating there. But yeah, so it has this pro-social effect, but pro-sociality is usually considered like compassion and empathy.
Right.
It's not often considered that retribution against an offender might be actually something pro-social. So there's this phenomenon in the literature called altruistic punishment, whereby, certain individuals may seek to punish offenders of moral norms, even at the cost, even when they incur some personal cost for doing so. So it's like they're really altruistic about the punishment. It's not about me. This is about you've done something wrong, and like deontically wrong here, objectively wrong in their view, and we want to, and we'll punish you, even if that means us incurring a cost. That's called altruistic punishment. And so this phenomenon does exist, but it's not often considered in the mindfulness space that one might engage in what is typically seen as a negative or potentially, vengeful-like behavior that actually is pro-socially oriented.
Right. And that's what I find fascinating about this is pro-social, the understanding of that as you're saying, is in a particular way of compassion and nice and nicey nice, but there's also the protective aspect of that, where an individual is actively causing harm. Having an engagement, a visceral response of you need to sit over there in the penalty box for a bit, because this is harmful. There is a protective aspect to pro-social behavior as well.
That's right. That's right. So we thought that was kind of an interesting aspect of the study as well, but just kind of turn the direction of the discourse towards, hey, you know, pro-sociality, it doesn't always mean warm and fuzzy.
Right, right. Now I want to ask, what, as you're doing this research and as you were uncovering what was, I imagine, quite surprising at the time, and then validated repeatedly, is for you personally, what are some things that this indicates to you about what mindfulness might offer to pragmatic issues in the world, seeing that there is this protective aspect to pro-social behavior too? What does that make you think of in the coming years of what might happen?
Oh, that's a great question. So a couple things. So one of our studies, just trying to think, it was study 2 in the final paper, was actually a study about consumer responses to corporate deviance, basically to acts by multinational corporations of unjust labor practices, environmental despoliation. Mm-hmm. And it took the perspective of a consumer witnessing and being told about through, in that case, a Financial Times article compared to a control condition. And, you know, dispositionally mindful consumers, we then, you know, gave them a shopping exercise, and I won't bore you with all the details about, you know, the pre-study we conducted and all the detail that went into it, but they were given a shopping exercise where everything like, you know, brand was washed out, price was neutralized, and they were given a certain amount of money to spend on products of 2 competing companies. And in the same industry, everything the same, except for some of the consumers were dispositionally more mindful, and others were dispositionally less mindful. And what came out was that mindful consumers were more likely to experience moral outrage at corporate injustice in the world, and to act on that, as a result, to act by punishing the offender, the corporation, with their wallets through their shopping behaviors. So as I think about that, I think that's actually a very interesting practical implication of this research, because, you know, ESG, you know, multinational corporations and their continue, you know, they're not angels, they're not devils either, but, you know, they will continue to engage in questionable business practices. And as mindfulness, I would say, continues to take root in society, as more and more people start practicing mindfulness and develop their dispositional mindfulness, or perhaps are more often in a mindful state. What this suggests is that even if regulators want to continue, you know, the deregulation movement, and, you know, allowing multinational corporations to act relatively unfettered in the international space, that provided that there's information about it, that consumers will take it within their own hands to hold them to account. Right. So that's happy news in a neoliberal era.
Yeah, their actions have consequences, and this
that's
is
right.
the way in which that may take form.
That's right. So that's one. I think that's really interesting. And the other, this actually didn't occur to me until after the paper was already published, but hear me out. So we know that so this has to do with actual cultural change in everyday workplaces. So we know that, based on prior research, that mindfulness makes victims of injustice less likely to get angry and retaliate. And in fact, we have data conducted over the course of this series of studies that replicated that. It didn't end up in the final package, but we know this to be true. Yeah. So mindful victims in the workplace, let's say, who experience injustice from a colleague or a supervisor, are less likely to retaliate. Great, that's one part. We also know that mindful individuals are, given its pro-social implications, are less likely to commit injustice against others. It doesn't mean they're not ever going to do it. There's no perfect human being, but less likely to do it. Yeah. Right? So there will be less injustice taking place in the first place. And when it does happen, victims are less likely to retaliate and set off a tit for tat kind of injustice spiral. That's fine. But now the third piece here with our paper is that even if those things happen, even if a perpetrator commits injustice against a colleague or a subordinate in the workplace, that there are many more observers typically of injustice than there are individuals who commit it or perceive it. And that to the extent that that mindfulness is taking place and organizations all continue to embrace mindfulness as a form of training or as a practice, that then the manyfold more observers of any injustice that might take place are then more likely to step forward and say to the perpetrator, hey, that's not actually how we do things around here, whether literally through their voice or through their actions, by teaching them some sort of a lesson to give that to impart that message. So when you put those three pieces of the puzzle together, it's less likely to take place in the first place. When it does, there's less likely to be retaliation. And even if there is retaliation, third-party observers are more likely to step in and say, no, that's not how we do things around here. What if you actually spin that forward across time and imagine what effect would that have on a workplace? Yeah. That could actually be an interesting agent of real cultural change in a workplace, whereby the standards become higher and higher, and that we treat each other just a little bit better.
Yeah. As you were describing this, that's what was coming to mind, is that this way of outsourcing cultural change just by the fact that there are those who are in place who might observe and be part of it in that way, and that they may step up, speak up in some fashion, and including on excessive retaliation or inappropriate retaliation as well, because that is also perceived as an injustice. Let's be clear here.
That's right.
I'm hoping that this gets to a tipping point, that this does what you've just described, bears out, and that there is that social support for pro-social behavior, and not so much I don't want to call it behavior modification, but ways in which it's simply in the best interests of businesses to behave in what we would consider obvious ethical norms that are today not observed.
That's right. And look, nobody, it's far easier to mind your own business and let people sort things out for themselves. That's the path of least resistance. But that's also the path by which toxic work environments perpetuate. Right. And this actually dovetails nicely with a previous study that I published in OBHDP just a few years ago that was on mindfulness and conflict. And I won't go too far down this rabbit hole, but it actually replicates in some way, because in that study, what we showed was, and this was with my co-author Daniel Skarlicki and I, what we showed was that we were kind of surprised by this finding, was that in conflict situations, mindfulness makes people who are engaged in conflict not just more likely to collaborate, but less likely to avoid. Yeah. More likely to lean into conflict, right? Which is kind of flies in the face of that mindfulness is everything's wavy gravy, it's all good, man. No. In fact, mindfulness makes people more likely, more willing to engage in conflict, precisely because they're more accepting, more able to process any negative emotions like anxiety that naturally surface in and around conflict situations. So it actually is a continuation of that story And I think that there's real promise in light of the data that's being generated, that, to the extent that mindfulness does continue to take root in society, we could experience culture shift whereby people are more likely to step up to conflict situations when necessary, but to do so in a way that's pro-social, that's collaborative, that's perhaps sends a signal, but only as strong as is necessary for that signal to be received.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, and I'm just so curious about what the coming years will hold, particularly in this research and ideas around changes in how people approach a mindfulness practice. That as there are increasingly lots and lots of ways in which people might download a free recording or something like that. And what I see from the perspective of someone who's been doing this a long time is I see a sharp rise in the number of mindfulness activities and offerings that are checking out. They are turning away from. And you're measuring dispositional mindfulness, so you got that part covered. I'm curious what it will be like over time, where there may be an increasing number of people who have an attitude of mindfulness is listening to a recorder, taking a break, some time away from the conditions, but then they go turn back towards them and they're ill-equipped to deal with what's there because all they've done is take a mini vacation. And that's not really what mindfulness is about. So I'm curious how that play out over the years too. I want to ask just a final question for you, if there's anything else you wanted to share with the listeners.
Just know out there that there are a few of us toiling away, few of us researchers out there in the business space who are, toiling away in relative obscurity, but we're really trying to do the best research we can. We take this very seriously, and we're not only interested in talking about all the rainbows and lollipops of mindfulness land, and that insofar as we are also trying to explore what are called boundary conditions and even potential dark sides of mindfulness, that we do so in service of what we think is a very serious and important phenomenon, and that's we take this very seriously, and we try to do the best research we can. There's no such thing as a perfect study. Every study has its flaws, but these studies take years and years, typically, from conception to publication, and it's because we really take it seriously and do our best to do justice to what we all think is a very important phenomenon.
I appreciate that, Adam. Thank you for the work you do and all the researchers who come on and speak here. Our guest today, Adam Kay. Adam, thank you so much for being here today. I hope you'll come back and speak with us again soon when you have more research and more interesting results to share with us.
Thanks so much, Ted. It's been a real pleasure.